Trade winds scrape beaches, rain rots timber, and thin soils limit food, forcing transient shelters where stillness, shade, and concealment stabilize life. Caribbean piracy, 17th century. Those constraints required landfall sites, minimizing exposure, while enabling departure under prevailing winds, currents, and patrol ranges that punished hesitation and rewarded immediate withdrawal at sea. That need for departure favored islands offering shallow anchorages nearby because deeper harbors trapped hulls longer, increasing exposure to sudden pursuit and shifting weather patterns offshore. Shallow anchorages limited vessels, forcing lighter craft and modular storage since deep keels grounded easily, constraining cargo mass, repair capacity, and time windows before tides reversed. Modular storage reduced ashore time, demanding camps assembled quickly overnight because lingering increased detection probability, moisture damage, and labor fatigue, without providing proportional gains in security. Quick assembly relied on scavenged materials shaped by island ecology, as importing timber or stone, imposed weight penalties, and reduced sailing performance critical for evasion operations. Island ecology restricted timber sizes, influencing shelter geometry and strength, since slow growth and thin soils produced short, twisted trunks unsuitable for spanning loads without bracing. Limited strength necessitated low profiles to resist wind loads, effectively because reduced surface area lowered overturning moments when gusts accelerated over beaches and ridges nearby islands. Wind resistance also controlled smoke dispersion, affecting cooking placement decisions, since rising plumes revealed camps, while lateral airflow diluted evidence faster across open shorelines at distance. Cooking placement influenced fire size, balancing heat output and fuel, because larger fires consumed scarce wood rapidly, while smaller hearths failed to dry bodies or tools. Fuel balance mattered because islands regenerated slowly under repeated visits, as cutting beyond regrowth. Thresholds stripped shelter materials, exposed soils, and shortened future usability for camps. Repeated visits increased detection risk, shaping concealment and movement patterns, since trails, cut stumps, and disturbed sands accumulated evidence visible to patrols or rivals over time. Concealment pressures encouraged inland camps, buffered by vegetation and terrain, because foliage absorbed sound, broke sight lines, and moderated wind compared with exposed beaches during daylight hours. Inland buffering increased hauling distances, demanding efficient labor organization systems to move water, timber, and stores without exhausting crews needed for sailing and defense duties later. Labor systems emerged from crew numbers, injury rates, and time since wounded men reduced carrying capacity, forcing task rotation and conservative workloads during extended stays ashore. Time constraints prioritized rest cycles aligned with tides and moon because darkness, currents, and water depth governed safe boat movement between ship and shore at night. Tidal alignment affected access routes, influencing lookout placement for safety, since rising water erased tracks, while falling tides exposed approaches vulnerable to surprise from enemies nearby. Lookout placement reduced surprise, but required elevation and exposure management, as higher ground improved sightlines, yet increased wind chill and visibility from afar across bays offshore. Exposure management relied on shade structures using sails and spars, because sun heated skin and gear rapidly, accelerating dehydration and material degradation during prolonged daylight hours. Sails and spars doubled as roofs, reducing carried materials weight, since repurposing ship gear avoided felling trees and preserved forests for future visits on frequented islands. Weight reduction preserved vessel performance, maintaining escape capability during raids as lighter hulls, accelerated faster, turned tighter, and required fewer hands under fire during pursuit scenarios. Raids dictated resupply needs, especially freshwater procurement methods ashore, because stored casks spoiled, leaked, or were lost, forcing frequent replenishment from unreliable rainfall patterns inland. Water procurement constrained camp locations near springs or catchments inland, since hauling heavy barrels over distance-exhausted crews, and increased exposure time along narrow trails ashore. Inland water sites reintroduced concealment challenges from smoke and tracks, because cooking and traffic concentrated signs near scarce sources that others also sought within confined valleys. Track management required hard substrates or tidal erasure nearby beaches, as soft soils recorded footprints, while waves reset sand predictably each cycle under normal tidal conditions. Beach proximity conflicted with inland shelter needs for camps overall, since beaches eased logistics, but exposed fires, noise, and silhouettes to passing ships along common routes. This conflict produced temporary camps, rotated between sites seasonally discreetly to exploit resources without exhausting them, while spreading risk across multiple locations during favorable sailing months. Rotation reduced resource depletion, extending island usefulness across months repeatedly because vegetation, game, and fuel recovered incrementally when pressure was intermittent rather than constant occupation cycles. Extended usefulness justified basic fortification against wildlife and rivals occasionally, as simple barriers deterred animals and delayed intruders long enough for withdrawal without signaling permanent intent. Fortification remained minimal, prioritizing invisibility over defense against organized forces, since any structure strong enough to fight invited attention beyond pirates' capacity to hold territory long. Invisibility strategies shaped waste disposal and sanitation practices to prevent accumulated refuse attracting animals, spreading disease, or marking occupation through smell detectable from distance over time. Prevention focused on disease, which weakened crews rapidly in camps because infection reduced manpower faster than combat, undermining sailing and security during prolonged humid periods ashore. Disease risk constrained camp density and duration during humid seasons, as crowded shelters trapped moisture, limited airflow, and accelerated transmission among fatigued men resting between watches. Seasonal humidity affected drying of food and powder stores ashore, since damp air slowed evaporation, promoting rot, mold, and unreliable ignition within enclosed shelters near shore. Drying constraints favored salted provisions and sealed containers against moisture because island humidity slowed evaporation, encouraging spoilage, unless salt reduced microbial growth during extended storage periods. Moisture control required airflow beneath shelters to limit rot development, because trapped dampness weakened fibers, shortened service life, and consumed replacement labor over repeated visits ashore. Rot development shortened shelter lifespans, reinforcing temporary construction philosophies overall, since investing heavily wasted effort on materials certain to decay under humidity, insects, and salt air. Temporary philosophies reduced investment, easing abandonment when patrols approached unexpectedly, because lightly built camps could be dismantled, burned, or left without sacrificing scarce tools or morale. Patrol threats shaped communication methods between ship and shore teams, since shouting or repeated signals carried far, attracting attention across water surfaces that amplified sound transmission. Communication relied on visual signals, constrained by terrain visibility ranges, because hills, trees, and curvature blocked lines of sight, forcing elevated positions and simple binary messages. Visibility limits dictated mast placement, or hilltop flags using contrast as darker backgrounds absorbed light, while pale cloth or smoke registered movement at distance quickly enough. Contrast materials were limited, favoring bleached cloth or smoke columns because pigments faded, metals corroded, and anything reflective risked capture, theft, or reuse by others later. Smoke signaling conflicted with concealment, requiring careful timing around weather, since rising plumes lingered in still air, but dispersed quickly under wind shifts or approaching rain. Weather timing exploited wind direction to disperse evidence from camps, because ash, smoke, and scent traveled downwind, reducing traces detectable from common sea lanes during daylight. Evidence dispersion never fully succeeded, leaving traces for rivals ashore since soil disturbance, cut wood, and altered vegetation persisted beyond weathering, signaling prior use to observers. Rival discovery risk encouraged misinformation and false camps nearby islands because decoys diverted pursuit, buying time for departure while exhausting attention and resources, searching empty sites. False camps consumed labor, reinforcing minimalism elsewhere across supply chains, since manpower spent misleading rivals reduced capacity for repairs, cooking, or watchkeeping within genuine camps nearby. Supply chains depended on captured goods and trade with locals because islands lacked surplus, forcing reliance on raids, barter, or coerced exchange to replace worn stores. Local trade imposed cultural constraints and secrecy on camp operations, since language, customs, and trust governed exchange, limiting numbers involved and discouraging facilities that revealed presence. Operational secrecy limited scale, preventing permanent settlements despite repeated use, because expansion increased visibility, supply demand, and defensive burden, undermining mobility that allowed survival under pursuit. Repeated use, nonetheless, created patterns archaeologists later identify through remains as hearths, post holes, and refuse accumulated subtly, revealing cycles of occupation invisible within written records alone. Those archaeological remains reflect hearth placement, dictated by ground insulation limits, since damp soil drained heat rapidly, forcing elevation or stone separation to maintain usable warmth. Soil moisture increased heat loss, requiring raised hearths or stone bases because water conducted heat away faster, chilling bodies, dampening flames, and increasing fuel consumption overnight. Stone bases depended on local geology, affecting thermal mass and fuel efficiency, since denser rock stored heat-smoothing temperature swings and reducing tending demands through nights. Fuel efficiency reduced night labor, preserving crew strength for sailing demands, because fewer tending trips lowered fatigue, accidents, and noise during hours when sound carried far. Reduced labor also limited noise, which carried farther over water since flat surfaces transmitted sound efficiently, betraying presence across bays during calm nights with little wind. Sound propagation shaped nighttime routines and tool use near camps because metal impacts rang sharply, while wood or fiber tools dampened vibrations, reducing detection risk nearby. Tool choice balanced noise against material fatigue during prolonged camp tasks, since softer tools wore faster, demanding replacement, but preserved secrecy essential for continued operations ashore. Prolonged tasks focused on repairing rigging stressed by salt exposure, because crystals abraded fibers, stiffened lines, and threatened failure under sail loads during maneuvers at sea. Fiber degradation forced frequent maintenance, anchoring camps near calm waters, since working aloft or repairing rigging required stable hulls, predictable tides, and minimal swell near shore. Calm waters increased insect pressure, affecting rest and disease exposure, because still air favored breeding, forcing men into smoky shelters that disrupted sleep and recovery cycles. Insect mitigation used smoke, again challenging concealment priorities ashore, because continuous smoldering revealed location, while intermittent fires failed to deter biting insects, carrying infection into camps. This conflict shifted fires downslope or seaward when winds allowed, since moving heat sources altered airflow, reduced visibility, and carried smoke away from vegetation lines inland. Seaward placement exploited cooler airflow, moderating heat and insects because temperature gradients drove breezes that diluted smoke, lowered heat retention, and discouraged insect swarms near shelters. Cooler airflow required wider shelter spacing to retain warmth nights, since convective losses increased when shelters clustered, forcing designs that balanced ventilation with shared body heat. Temperature variability limited shelter comfort, reinforcing short stays ashore because thin walls lacked thermal mass, causing rapid cooling after sunset, discouraging long occupation despite available resources. Short stays reduced psychological strain from exposure and vigilance, since constant alertness eroded judgment, and predictable departure dates preserved morale, discipline, and cohesion under persistent threat. Vigilance demands structured guard rotations shaped by crew size, because limited manpower forced watches to balance rest, alertness, and coverage without exhausting sailors needed for sudden departure. Spatial layout of camps reflected efficient coverage with minimal personnel, since shelters, fires, and boats were arranged to shorten response distances during alarms or shifting winds. Vegetation clearing balanced sightlines against labor and concealment costs, because excessive cutting revealed occupation, while insufficient clearing limited early warning and escape reaction time. Regrowth rates influenced how often sites could be reused safely, as fast-returning vegetation masked traces, whereas slow regrowth preserved evidence for rivals or patrols. Reuse safety required fire suppression to prevent visible scars, because burned ground and charcoal patches persisted, marking locations long after departure under tropical conditions. Ash was dispersed or buried to camouflage prior occupation, since concentrated deposits altered soil color and chemistry, signaling repeated fires to experienced observers ashore. Soil disturbance remained visible, limiting effectiveness of concealment, because footprints, pits, and compacted paths endured beyond rain cycles, especially on clay or loam substrates. Imperfect erasure was accepted, relying instead on mobility advantages, since removing every trace cost time better spent preserving speed, surprise, and freedom of movement. Mobility reduced need for fortification or permanent infrastructure ashore, because the ability to leave quickly outweighed benefits of defending fixed positions against superior forces. Beach geometry affected hauling boats for maintenance between raids, since steep slopes strained crews, while flat gradients eased drying, scraping, and repair of hulls. Drying hulls slowed marine growth, improving speed temporarily, because exposure killed fouling organisms that otherwise increased drag and reduced maneuverability under sail. Maintenance windows were brief, constrained by tides and patrol cycles, since low water exposed hulls briefly before risk increased with daylight and passing traffic. Tidal range dictated work schedules and camp rhythms, because rising water set deadlines, while falling tides determined access points and hauling distances each cycle. Fatigue accumulation further limited how long camps remained viable, since repetitive hauling, watchkeeping, and repairs eroded strength faster than recovery allowed ashore. Departure decisions balanced fatigue against supply depletion trends, because leaving too late risked weakness, while leaving early forfeited scarce repairs or provisioning opportunities. Lower supplies, increased risk tolerance, shortening shore occupation since hunger and thirst forced bolder sailing choices rather than prolonged exposure at vulnerable camps. Weather observation guided departures, reading clouds and wind shifts, because storms or calms altered escape probabilities more decisively than enemy movements alone. Storm shelter ashore was inadequate, encouraging early return aboard, since flimsy structures failed against wind and rain loads better absorbed by ships designed for seas. Thus, vessels remained primary habitats, camps serving auxiliary functions, because ships provided storage, protection, and mobility unmatched by temporary island constructions. Auxiliary roles justified minimal design and rapid dismantling, since camps existed only to support ships, not replace them as living spaces. Material recovery reduced waste and future scavenging effort, because reusable spars, cloth, and containers were scarce and expensive to replace through raids alone. Recovered components circulated between islands, with crews over seasons, since portability allowed familiar materials to reappear in successive camps across regions. Seasonal patterns linked camps into informal networks of knowledge, because sailors shared memories of winds, water sources, and safe beaches over repeated circuits. Knowledge passed orally, avoiding written maps that risked capture, since memory-based navigation protected secrets even if individuals were taken or killed. Landmarks replaced maps, shaping which islands were repeatedly favored, because distinctive hills, reefs, or trees anchored mental charts resistant to confiscation. Overuse increased exposure, forcing eventual abandonment cycles, since familiarity bred predictability, inviting patrol focus and rival competition at known refuges. Abandoned sites explain gaps in historical records of bases, because transient camps rarely warranted documentation and vanished before authorities could record them. Physical evidence survives unevenly, shaped by erosion and reuse since storms, vegetation, and later occupants altered or erased traces unpredictably. High erosion erased structures, reinforcing archaeological scarcity, because wind, rain, and waves dismantled light constructions faster than durable stone foundations. Misconceptions arise from scarcity, not absence of systematic camps, because limited remains obscure the repeated, organized nature of temporary occupation. These camps functioned as adaptive systems, not fixed settlements, since every element responded dynamically to pressure, resource limits, and pursuit. Constraint shaped every choice, from shelter to signaling, because physical limits of environment and bodies dictated feasible solutions over intention or tradition. Balance between exposure and concealment created temporary stability, since camps endured only while trade-offs remained tolerable under changing conditions. Movement remained inevitable, as islands could never fully sustain permanence, because ecological limits, detection risk, and mobility requirements constantly forced departure.